This is the Dean Abbott podcast. Today, my guest is Jane Greer, a poet living in North Dakota and author of the collections Love Like a Conflagration and The World as We Know It is Falling Away. Thanks for doing this.
Oh, it's very nice to be here. Thank you.
How's it going out there in North Dakota?
Oh, we're doing great. We for some reason, we missed the monster storm that's raging from the West Coast to the East Coast. It kind of drooped around us, so we're happy about that.
Not too long ago, I read Dakota by Catherine Patterson. Do you know that book? Her book about her life in North Dakota?
I don't know that book.
Maybe I'm mentioning I may be getting the author's name wrong because I think I've got it confused with someone else. But Kathleen Norris, maybe.
Norris, yes. Kathleen Norris, yes.
Yes. Okay, Kathleen. Whoever the first person I said was a different author, but Kathleen Norris is the author of Dakota. So that's an interesting book. So you're missing the weather, you were saying?
Yes, we are. Very happily.
Yes. How does it go? I think I first came to know about you by someone posting somewhere a link to your poem, Old Dog. As you recall.
My. Yes. That was a while ago.
And I loved that poem, and I think I then started following you on Twitter. We're connected there. How's Twitter going for you?
I love Twitter or X, and I think for the next 100 years we're going to be saying X. I mean Twitter. I mean X.
Right.
But I love it. There's some nastiness on there, and I just avoid it or block it or move past it. But I have never had such a community of like-minded people. So there are poets. I have a community of poets. I have a community of Catholics. I have and never before has this been able to happen. Mm-hmm. It doesn't happen on Facebook.
Right.
It's wonderful.
I have noticed, and I'm beginning to think I'm correct. You tell me what you think. But it seems to me that we are at the beginning of or in the middle of a kind of resurgence of interest in poetry, especially among religious people and people who are somewhat right of center. And I think you see a lot of that on Twitter.
Yes.
You agree with all that?
I do agree with that. And frankly, Twitter may be the only place those people can raise their heads. And not be afraid to be shamed or doxxed or whatever. But I agree. And as far as the resurgence of poetry, it has never been easier to get a poem in front of people. So yes, Twitter's helping with that.
Mm-hmm. I wonder what accounts for this sort of sudden interest in poetry, which for a long time kind of languished as the sort of the arena of either academics or the woke. And all of a sudden it seems to me that there's much more of a push toward kind of creating a new kind of poetry that has a different sensibility and that is oriented again toward a wider audience. I don't know if you're noticing that, but I think that I'm seeing it.
Well, yeah, and you mentioned slightly, right of center, or even more than slightly. So you say Twitter. I'm sorry. You talked about academia and the woke, and right now those two words are almost synonymous. Mm-hmm. But that mindset does not encourage good poetry. Mm-hmm. And, the pendulum is always swinging. So we've had the woke political poetry for a while now, or any kind of political poetry, and then the pendulum swings the other way, and people say, that there could be more to poetry than politics, and in fact, politics kind of guarantees that a poem will not be great. So yes, I think we're seeing that, and I really do credit social media and Twitter in particular for helping that happen.
How does politics kind of guarantee that a poem won't be great?
Because it's too small. The subject is too small. Poetry, great poetry, lets us look past the veil into another world that's a truth that we just don't see all the time. And politics is all about this world, this earth, and somebody's opinion, and usually about human power. When you get right down to it. And so it's a very, very small subject for people to be thinking about and writing about all the time. So it kind of wastes a poem. If you try to write a poem on a political subject, now there are exceptions to that, but basically, politics sucks the life out of poetry. It doesn't let it be as grand. Oh, that's not the right word. It doesn't let it explain great things the way poetry can.
Mm-hmm. In the end, I suppose politics is a very non-mysterious arena of human life in a way. And poetry is a way of finding your way into the more mysterious arenas of human life.
Yes, politics is mysterious to me, but I know what you're saying. It's totally earthly,
right?
And there is a veil between us and a greater truth a lot of the time. And people who don't want to look through that veil, they don't have to. They can live perfectly happily without it. But there are things beyond the veil that a lot of us would like to know. Why does this happen? What makes this happen so often? What kind of a God do we have? How does our God treat us? You can't talk about that in a political poem.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And you think that's the purpose of poetry, to help us see what's on the other side of that veil?
Well, it's one of the things it can do. Poetry is, now, I want to make it clear, this is Jane's opinion. And if I were posting this, I'd get a lot of pushback from a lot of poems, because there is really no definition of poetry. We have PhDs teaching poetry, and we have people taking those courses and then writing poetry, but they're very hesitant to define poetry. But I think if you cut to the very bone, first of all, poetry is language that's used to the fullest, used in a way that prose just doesn't do. And what's that language? Why do we do that? What's that language for? Well, my very favorite poet, Josephine Jacobson. You might never have heard of her.
I don't know her.
She was the U.S. Poet Laureate for a number of years back in the 70s.
I've heard of her. Yes. Okay. Now, yes. Go ahead, please.
I bring her up once in a while, but she talks about poetry being an instant of knowing. So you're reading a poem, you're reading along, and then if it's a great poem, there comes a moment when those words have been used in such a way that you go, oh, it doesn't tell you, but it leads you into that instant of knowing that, oh, that is the truth. That, yes, that's how things work. So I think if poetry doesn't at least do that, use its language, which, it can include meter, rhyme is a form of meter, all the things we can do with words, all the sounds we make with words. If it doesn't do that, and if it doesn't lead the reader to, or hearer, to a moment of epiphany about something, maybe just how an old dog is like an old person, then I don't know that we can call it a poem, or at least it's not a very good poem. So I think I might have lost track of your question. But.
No, I can't. I think it may have been Archibald MacLeish who said the purpose of a poem is not to mean but to be. And I think all of that is correct. Everything you just said, I agree with. But I would also sort of add that I think you're kind of pushing in this direction, that one of the differences between a poem and a piece of prose is that the poem is not necessarily there to tell you something. It's not necessarily there to inform you of something. It's there to be a thing that you experience. And
Yes,
in the
yes,
experiencing of it, you come to that epiphany.
yes,
I,
and it's magic.
mm,
And
I,
I don't think poems should ordinarily tell us things. They should open a door with language for us to come to that understanding.
mm-hmm. The do you know the poem by Pat Schneider called "The Patience of Ordinary Things"? You may not know that, but
I don't.
it's a wonderful poem, and it ends with the last line, "And what is more generous than a window?" But by the time you see why that's a good line.
Yes.
But by the time, it's a short poem, but by the time you arrive at the last line, you feel what she's saying. And she's created an experience. But I could not tell you, what does it mean for a window to be generous? It implies many things, but it's not just simply she's not simply naming a principle for me, but she's created a work of
Yes.
art into which the reader or the hearer enters. And when we get to that last line, we suddenly see something that we didn't see before.
Oh, yeah. There, she has made a window.
Yes,
Yes.
exactly. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. She's a wonderful poet. Um, did you write a poem today?
I did not.
How do you do that? How do you go about write? Do you write a poem every day, most days?
Oh, no. Have always been a very slow poet. Except the one exception was 2020,
Mm-hmm.
when we all had to stay inside for a while.
Mm-hmm.
That was creatively the best year of my life. I just I could not turn it off. It was marvelous, and it hasn't happened since, and it won't happen again, I'm sure. But no, I'm very slow, and I keep a kind of a fat notebook with little shards of poems, or a line even, or a word that I think I could play around with, and then I'll go back and something will strike me, and I'll work with it. I usually have 4 or 5 poems on the burner, just kind of waiting to be completed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I Probably my favorite poet is William Stafford. You may know William Stafford.
Yes.
And William Stafford apparently got up around 4 o'clock every morning for 40 years and just sat down and wrote a poem every single day.
Well,
Now,
I bow to him.
well, everyone does.
Yes.
Right? Now, so I recently thought, well, I'll try it. And I haven't written a poem every single day, but probably most days for the last month, I've written a poem. And sometimes they're even good.
Yeah.
How when you're writing a poem, how do you know if it's good or not?
Um, well, it's purely selfish. Would it please me? Does it please me? Are there things going on here that that I really get a kick out of? Um, would it be too much for other people? Would it go past them? Have I said too much? Have I explained too much? I never feel any guilt about cutting ever. So, in fact, the shorter the better for me, for my own poems.
In terms of cutting and explaining too much, I'm a big cutter too. I like sort of sparse poems. But I think that is a reflection of the approach to poetry we were just talking about, where if you feel like the point of your poem is to tell someone something as opposed to create an experience in language, you might feel more of an obligation to explain.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think, yeah, that makes sense. And I think that makes it harder to create a really good poem. If what you really want to do is explain something important to you, you might want to try some prose.
Mm-hmm. The Have you written poetry since you were a child?
The first poem I remember writing was in middle school, and I don't remember the poem. I had to bring a poem the next day for English, and I didn't remember it. So I'm very young. I didn't remember it till midnight. I woke up and thought, oh, I need a poem, and so I wrote a poem. I looked
Not
out
a
my
slow
bedroom
poet right
window.
then.
Pardon?
I said not a slow poet right then.
Well, not right then. Well, I was under the gun. And I don't remember that at all. And then in high school and college, I wrote a lot, and it was free verse, usually about some boy, or another.
Mm-hmm.
And then in my 20s, I kind of discovered meter and rhyme, and it made writing poetry just difficult enough that it was interesting all over again.
Mm-hmm. 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 And so you've written regularly since your 20s.
Yes, not quickly. Well, and also I took about 30 years off,
Well,
from the early 80s or from the late 80s to about 2018 or so. And in that time, we raised our son. I had a really demanding job. And somehow I was sad about it. I mourned it, but I just couldn't squeeze a poem out, not even a bad poem. I just didn't have it. And then my husband and I kind of fell in love with New Orleans. It's a foreign country from here in Bismarck, North Dakota. And we would go there a couple of times a year. And I was sitting alone in a little cafe in Jackson Square, and this poem came to me almost finished.
Mm-hmm.
And I did not have pen or paper on me. So I scurried up and down the square trying to buy a little pad of paper, and somebody finally helped me out there. And between that and my phone, I wrote this poem. And it's like God turned the spigot off 30 years before, and then on that day, he turned it back on. That's the only way I can explain it, because I didn't do anything to make that happen.
Mm-hmm. What is, you talked about the spigot, and earlier you said during that time you just didn't have it. What is it? What is the spigot? Is it an attitude on your end? Is it a mood? Is it a condition of life that allows something to come through? Is it something more mysterious and spiritual?
Well, to me, it is mysterious and spiritual. And I can see where other people might think that that sounds kind of precious or smacks of religiosity or something. But all I mean by it is that my job is to stay ready.
Mm.
And I guess it's been called a muse before, but I don't have a muse. I have words or phrases that somehow, with God, I can put together in this way or that way. But my job is to stay ready for that.
I think that in my experience as a poet too, that one thing that's helpful is to try to retain or to cultivate an inner sense of receptivity.
Yes, good word.
And I don't know if you understand what I mean, but if you do, you want feel free to talk about it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Are you?
Well, I was just going to say, I have a deep sense that when I write a bad poem, I am writing the poem, and I have a deep sense that when I am writing a good poem, I am receiving it.
Yes, absolutely. That is, you said that beautifully.
Mm-hmm.
And I know an awful lot of poets that over the years have said things like, here's this great poem, and it's a really good poem. Who did that? I can't write like that. I couldn't write that poem. But here it is on my laptop. How did that happen? And so there is something outside of us. But yes, the receptivity, and yes, when we write something that's second rate, it's us, it's all us, because we don't receive second rate material. We receive first rate material.
Yes.
We don't always know what to do with it.
Yes. And the other thing in terms of just the writing process, and maybe you feel this too, is that sometimes I'm not a slow poet. I just slop it down, right, all at once. And but often I have a feeling that in the middle of what I'm writing, I get a sense of how it should end, where it should go, and it's sort of as if the poem wants to go someplace. And I have to overcome my own resistance to letting it go there. Do you ever feel?
Yes. Oh, I feel that way often. It has to do with ego. You have to. I'll say I have to let my ego completely disappear, or make room for whatever's coming. And there have been many poems where I have started out knowing exactly what I wanted to do and where I wanted to go, and some of the phrases I wanted in there and how I wanted it to end. And yeah, midway through, I realized that's not where this is going. But now that I've seen it, it can't go anywhere else than where it's going. And a couple of times it's been 180 degrees different from what I set out to do, but so much better, because I could put me down and let this poem happen.
Mm-hmm. And so there's the exhilarating thing, if you write poetry in this way, is that it is a sort of a constant process of surprise for you, the poet.
Yes.
Is it just
Yes.
like when you said it's on my laptop, but I know, did I really write this? You have that feeling that
Yeah, I'm not that good. How did I do this?
right,
Yeah.
right. Exactly. Um, Other than Josephine Jacobson, are there poets that you love, whose poems you love?
Oh, that's a question that audiences always ask a poet. And for me, it's very hard to answer because I love so many different kinds of poets. I'm not going to mention any contemporary poets because I'll leave somebody out. And a lot of them are on Twitter in my little community. But I do, I love Walt Whitman, who just really, he contains multitudes. And he lets it all out on the page, but it's not, but it's musical. Mm-hmm. I think, when possible, a poem should be musical because that's something that prose doesn't often do. Mm-hmm. And so I do love him. Everybody's favorite, of course, is Gerard Manley Hopkins. Yes, I do love him. No, there's nobody like him. There will never be anybody like him. So yeah, that's a given. Okay. But I don't read a lot of poetry anymore. I don't read anybody really, except once in a while. And there's a point at which reading other poets that you love or hate doesn't help you as a poet anymore. Mm-hmm. For a number of years in my life, I had a spiritual director. Mm-hmm. And at one point, she and I discovered something that was pretty big for me. And it's always between the directee and God. We don't get into anything but that relationship. And I agreed with her that I need to explore this a little bit more. Tell me some books I can read. And she said, no, I'm going to kind of forbid you to read any books about this. You need to pray about it and think about it. You need to learn it that way rather than reading about it. And she was so right. At that point, reading books about it would have been a way to put some distance between me and that real subject. And so I kind of feel that way about reading other poets. I have a lot of friends who are very good poets, and they read a ton of poetry. And God bless them. I'm happy for them, but I don't anymore because right now I want to just be receptive to whatever comes to me. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You mentioned poets that you hate. Is there anyone who you want to name?
No, there's no one I want to name.
I'll tell you this. I went back and was reading a few weeks ago a poem by Allen Ginsberg, and I'll just be on the record saying I don't like Allen Ginsberg.
There's not a lot of music in Allen Ginsberg.
Right, to say the least. When you started writing poems, were you good from the beginning?
Oh, I don't think anybody is. Like I said, I went through probably 15 years of lovesick free verse. Everybody has to grow into it.
Yeah. Can you tell us what that growth process was like for you?
I'm not sure I can. Um, I found one journal who kind of liked my poems and offered me a little bit of encouragement, and that seed fell on ground that was just waiting for seed. And so that helped get me started. But as far as my writing changing, I guess I'd have to credit some editors who said to me, this is good, but this line here is really cloying, or you've said too much here. You need to think about maybe saying less. So perceptive editors who are always busy, but they took a moment to give me a little advice because they saw something there. That was worth gold.
What difference does being Catholic make to the way you write poetry?
I see the world through a Catholic lens. That's what makes the Catholic poet. They're poets that I and other writers like Dana Gioia, consider Catholic poets who maybe aren't Catholic at all and have never been, but to see the world, to see the sacraments in the world, to understand about suffering and redemption and all of the big things that go with the Catholic faith. Not the little stuff that isn't required, but the big Catholic beliefs. That colors how I see the world and what interests me to write about and how I say things.
How does it influence how you say things?
Because I want to be true to how I see the world. And if I'm talking about something that is grand, I want the reader to feel that grandness. If I'm talking about something that, pain or suffering or remorse that is grinding and bitter, I want to try to convey that. And so it's one big ball of wax. My faith, my words, my approach, it's all one thing.
Do you think good poetry has a kind of spiritually formative effect, or maybe bad poetry does too, effect on the reader?
Allen Ginsberg.
Right, I was going to say there's a reason not to read Allen Ginsberg often.
It can have a spiritually formative effect, like almost everything else. It's there. If you want to see it, it's there. If you're not looking for it or don't want to see it, then it's not there.
It's interesting. I mentioned William Stafford earlier, and I've written probably a dozen tweets about William Stafford because as I read his work, I encounter him more and more, not merely as a poet, but almost as a sort of as a kind of spiritual leader who's showing me something very important and forming in me a kind of spiritual sensibility. I think he's very, very helpful to me in that way. And I think that about many of the poets I love. I know that he's popular for other things, but I think Wendell Berry is a fantastic poet among, in addition to being a fantastic novelist as well, right? And
Yeah,
essayist.
yeah.
But as a poet, he's great. And the ability of these poets to transmit a a spiritual, almost well, I suppose transmit a spirit, transfer a spirit, is part of what I think is most amazing about them. I don't know if you've had that experience or not, but
Yes, oh yes, I agree about Stafford.
and others. And don't you think it's really a matter of them in the course of writing that poem, or maybe in the course of their life, sometimes them diminishing their own ego
mm-hmm.
and letting the mystical happen.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You can prevent the mystical things from happening if that's what you want to do.
Mm-hmm.
But to let them happen, you have to get yourself out of the way. And so
Mm-hmm.
when a poet does that, um, then marvelous things happen.
It may be part of the reason that we like the poems that we do is because the default human way of being is to be devoted to preventing the mystical. And
Ah,
and these poems give us a break from that. I suspect that's true.
wow, I like that. I would have to think about it.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, we're kind of afraid of the mystical, and
A good poem can take us there before we know it,
Mm-hmm.
and then we can see, oh, this isn't creepy. It's beautiful.
Is poetry just for like smart people who can figure it out?
yeah, really.
That's what I was thinking too.
Yeah.
Right.
No. It's been nice talking to you. Um, no, poetry is for,
Anyone who wants to understand poetry and love it can. But there again, you want it, you want to love it, you're making yourself receptive to it. If you
Mm-hmm.
don't, you won't.
What do you say though to people who have a kind of prejudice against poetry where they think it's something that the normal person can't understand? They're alienated from it some way.
well, they're just wrong, but that's not going to help me.
Persuade them.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, sometimes I have tried to find an example of a kind of poem that I think a person who hates poetry would like,
Mm.
and give that to them. Um, Sometimes it helps, sometimes it doesn't. And poetry is not for everybody. Nothing's for everybody. Poetry is not going to save the world or change the world, but it can enlighten and delight a lot of people. And you add all of that up, and it makes a better world.
Mm-hmm. What's the difference between being a formalist poet and being a free verser?
In, of course, in both those titles, Both of those titles are
contain a lot of different worlds. There are many kinds of formalists, many kinds of free versers. But the difference is that a formalist establishes rules, arbitrary or not, that help the poem make a certain kind of music. It could be the meter, it could be the rhyme, it could be internal rhyme in lines. It could be, long flowing lines or very short staccato lines. But there are rules that the formalist follows. She follows a form, and a free verse poet doesn't do that, or does a lot less of it. That is not to say that a poet who writes free verse doesn't choose language carefully, because many of them do. And you can tell the difference between, okay, I'll say a name, Rupi Kaur, and a good free verse poet. But it's still different from a formalist poem, because more is allowed, and there's less ear pleasure. Maybe saying it that way is the right way to go.
Less ear pleasure in what?
To me, there's less ear pleasure in a free verse poem than in a formal poem. Now, some formal poems are so perfectly formal that they're boring. So yeah, there's all of that happening too. But in good free verse and a good formalist poem, the formalist poem pleases my ear more. In free verse, it's much more easy to have a brilliant thought, to have a brilliant idea, and just write that idea down. And you don't have to make it rhyme with anything. It doesn't have to fit a certain meter. So you've written down your brilliant idea, and the poem is kind of made up of brilliant ideas, or of lines that lead toward that brilliant idea. And to me, that might just as well be prose.
I can see that. And you find that the form helps you as a poet too?
Yes, it does. That old
cliche about playing tennis without a net, you can't do better than that cliche. That's exactly what free verse is, and maybe you can have an awful lot of fun playing tennis without a net, but I like the net.
It defines the game in a way.
Yes.
I didn't prepare you for this, but I wondered if you have a poem handy that you'd like to read to us.
Sure, I can do that. Do you have one that you'd like me to read?
You want to read the one, the most recent one that I saw in First Things about the hibiscus?
Oh, sure.
Was that your most recent publication?
It is, yes. And I have a couple more coming out, but that's it. Okay.
This is called In the Activities Room. And I'll talk about that afterwards.
Okay.
In the activities room. No one will say it, but we know today's fresh-flamed hibiscus flower reveals in one brief, glorious show our birth, our life, our final hour. Sacrament and synecdoche live in a pot near the atrium door. mirroring holy brevity, which in a day is evermore.
Lovely. Now, what's the
Thank
form
you.
of?
It's just it's AB rhyme. It's 4 beats per measure per line. So tetrameter. Pretty simple. Don't know what else I could say about it. That this poem hung around in my little notebook for a couple of years, and it lacked something, and I didn't know what it lacked. And then I glanced at it one day, and I thought, "Oh, I know what it needs," and I finished it. So that's how I work a lot of the time. I have to wait to, let it boil, let it simmer for a while. I don't know how many people know this, but a hibiscus flower usually dies after one day. And so, and in the activities room and then near the atrium door, I was envisioning a nursing home. But you don't have to know any of that, I hope, to kind of see where the poem is going.
Do you often give advice to young poets?
If they ask me, I try to help. Yes, because people.
All right,
help
so
me.
let's assume that one of those people is listening. What's your the upshot of your advice?
If you are a young
poet in formation or a middle-aged poet in formation, find out what appeals to your ear and your mind. Read a lot of poems, but don't rely on them. You can certainly, in the early stages, copy them, but not copy, but try to emulate them. But honestly, poetry is mostly a matter of loving language and being receptive to something you can do with that language to create a moment of understanding in the reader.
Yes, it's both.
Is that vague enough for you?
No, it's great. It's there's a craft to poetry that can be studied.
Yes.
And then there is a sort of disposition, I think, for, well, maybe not every poet, but there's a disposition that is helpful, at least to me, to cultivate.
Yes.
In terms of what we were saying about receptivity, et cetera.
Yes.
How did you go about publishing your books?
My first book, which also appears in my second book.
My first book was back in 1986. And honestly, I don't know how I wrote to them. But the publisher was Harry Duncan, who was quite famous. I did not know at the time. I was really clueless. I've in my life, I've been clueless until like 10 minutes ago.
Oh, sure.
And so,
that probably helps you. Probably helps.
But I sent him my manuscript and he liked it. And he was at the in Omaha at the university there, and he did letterpress books in a hand press, and they're famous. They're worth a lot of money, not because of who's in them, but because Harry Duncan published them. So he published that first book, 300 copies. I got 30 of them. And then I went into this period of not really writing poetry anymore. And and then started up again back in 2018 or 2019. And so I had another book's worth of poems, and my publisher, Lamming Press, was kind of willing to just republish the first book, but I added a second book to it, and and then I liked working with them so much that I offered them my second book back in 2022 also. And I got to work with a designer on the cover and the insides, and everybody was easy to work with. And they're a very small press, but they do. They publish, who they like. They publish some very good writers, and so for me, those books came easily.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for doing this. I've really enjoyed it and learned a lot. Tell people where they could find you online. Your book's available on Amazon, I suppose.
My books are on Amazon. I'm on Twitter or X at North Dakota Jane, mm-hmm. and I'm on Facebook too, Jane Greer. But Twitter's more fun.
It is. All right. Thank you very much. And will you tell me you'll come back sometime and do it again?
You ask and I'll be back. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's great. Thank you.